Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. It's Friday, July 25th. Wow, July 25th, 2025, episode 447. And we're going to talk about Walter Williams and whether arbitrary racism um, is a significant factor in our society today. That's something that we have to legislate against. Well, just before we do that, just want to make note that Congress recessed early. I guess they were sent home early to avoid voting on an Epstein bill. All of this, uh, this clown show, this circus that we're watching on the news should make it really obvious that people will only pontificate and will only raise a stink about something when they know they cannot change the outcome of the vote. I'll say that again because it's opposite of what most people think. But when you get those certain grandstanders, and I'm not talking about people like Thomas Massey. I'm talking about people who will only once in a while be really, really loud about something. Um, and if they were principled, they'd be loud all of the time, just like Thomas Massey is, right? And he's always loud about the same things over and over again. But all of these other grandstanders, and that's who would be a grandstander when they only get up and say something when they know that no matter what they say, the outcome of the vote will not change. Right. And so when the Democrats were in power, you saw many, many Republicans getting up and saying, oh, how dare they do this? But now that they're in power, they don't say anything. And that's because they don't want to change the outcome of the vote. When they were not in power, they knew they couldn't influence the vote, right? The vote outcome was going to be what it was. And so they can say anything that they want and try to go for those sound bites and make it look good. And they're a champion for freedom. But when they are in power, they don't want to say anything that will upset the cart, that will upset their donors, that will upset the party, and so on and so forth. And so Democrats are loudest when Republicans are in power, and Republicans are loudest when Democrats are in power. And that's just kind of how the game works. But it is interesting to note that that the Obama collusion against Trump, right, his using government resources to undermine Trump's election prospects in 2016, uh, to see that that is less significant than the Epstein information is pretty funny. Something like that's borderline, if not treasonous, is less important and less significant to the people involved than releasing all of the Epstein files. That should tell you something. And I know that no one is going to go to jail as a result of this. They never do. All right. So I was listening to, so Mises is having its summer institute right now. And today they had uploaded an episode by Wanjiru Najoya. I hope I said that right, but she's pretty much the go-to person when it comes to racial issues being discussed by Mises. And I don't think it's an accident that she's also Black. I hesitate to say African American because she is African or from the Caribbean. And generally, those two subcategories of people or those two types of people generally do not like being called African American. So I'll just use Black, just like Walter Williams always just simply used the word Black or Negro, which I think is has fallen out of favor. No one really uses it that way. And so I sat down and I said, oh, I'll do my episode on what she talks about in this episode because it was about race and discrimination. However, once she began, she said that she changed it a little bit and that she was going to discuss Walter Williams' book, Race and Economics. Walter Williams, you may know, passed away last year or a few years ago and was a giant in the economic world. But he wrote a book, Race and Economics: How Much Can Be Blamed on Discrimination, is the name of the book. And it just so happens that I excerpted that book for my book, right? And so I've explained before that the book that I had written was a Frankenstein kind of book. It started off as a reader, just a collection of the readings that I would assign to class, and it became sort of half a reader, just a few articles to keep the price down, but a lot of my stuff, right? Original stuff that I had come up with that I would teach in my classes. So that's why it was kind of a Frankenstein book. It was supposed to be a reader, and so I had picked out all these articles. But when they started telling me how expensive it was going to be, I took out a lot of the articles and also asked them if I can just put my original stuff in there, and they said, "Wow, that's fine." So anyway, I excerpted his book and I built a chapter around it. So I put in his excerpt and then I had a comment. I made comments on it after, and I think it was it was one of his earlier chapters from that book. The title, I think, might have been even the introduction, but I think it might have been chapter one. And the title of the chapter was How Much Can Be Blamed on Discrimination? And generally, what his argument, I'll just summarize, you can read his book, but the main point was that racism, as most people imagine it, is not enough to keep Black people down. Blacks worked as skilled and unskilled craftsmen and business owners. Whites sought them out because of market forces. So the market is relatively colorblind and impersonal. And I talk about how the free market is impersonal. It doesn't care about you or me. It cares about what's being sold and at what cost. And I go into that in episode 29, way back in the day. But because markets really don't care about, the person who's doing business, all it cares about is what they are selling and at what price. So markets do not respect, and these are Walter Williams's words, markets do not respect privilege, race, and class. Better prices, quality, and service matter more. So basically, society and whites hired blacks because their wages were lower or their work was better than the competition. So people have always sought to use laws to accomplish what they cannot accomplish through voluntary peaceable exchange. Restrictive laws harm blacks equally, whether they were written with the explicit intent to eliminate black competition or written with such benign goals as protecting public health, safety, and welfare, and preventing the exploitation of workers. And here we can see that issue that I always raise, how people use virtue signaling to do other things, right? Say, oh, we're going to prevent the exploitation of workers. But really, we're going to try to put Black people out of work. This is the game that is also being played, which I've talked about numerous times as well, right? So again, virtue signaling or claiming that you are politically active, right? You're engaging in activism for something which is moral, for something which is good. And the useless idiots in society believe it without understanding the mechanisms of government. Like a lot of people believe that as long as you're fighting for the right thing, that good things will happen in society. And no, that's just really, really lazy, super lazy, ignorant, criminally ignorant attitudes and behaviors in society today. Right. So that was his argument in the little excerpt that I had put in the book. And so these are my comments on his chapter. So, first of all, Walter Williams, is African American, grew up in North Philadelphia, single parent home, went into the army, was really. Did I mention that, when my book came out, I emailed him and I said, "Hey, I put one of your chapters in my book. Do you want to read it?" And he declined. He was also, it turns out he died only a couple of years later. So, yeah, he was not really interested. He just, I guess, was kind of relaxing, but it was really cool that I was able to exchange emails with him. I'm a huge fan. But anyway, he's not condoning attitudes and behaviors. Rather, he wants resources and attention expended elsewhere instead of redistribution of wealth, right? Which is what the socialists always want to do. Oh, let's tax the rich and give it to the poor, right? So instead of doing that, which is a waste of time and energy and capital, instead of doing that, do something else, right? And he points out throughout his book, right, Race and Economics, that economic success can be achieved even in the time of slavery. And this is not to say that slavery is okay and slavery is not an issue, because clearly it was. But even in the time of slavery, you will see examples of slaves becoming extremely wealthy, right? And so arbitrary discrimination by itself is so expensive that something like slavery is unsustainable, right? So I've always made the argument that if you have to use force, right, you're going to use coercion, whether it be through, me getting up in your face or legislation, because legislation is coercive, right? You must do it this way, right? So if you are using coercion, it's really expensive, right? Because now you have to expend all these resources to enforce that law. Much, much better, much more efficient and cheaper is to let people just do what they want to do, right? Voluntary cooperation. But no, people generally don't do that. They get on their high horse and they say, "No, I know what's best for everybody, and everyone must do it this way," which is just totally idiotic. But nevertheless, that's how many people are trained to think. But anyway, so the desire to make and save money overcomes the desire to arbitrarily discriminate, right? So some people in society are haters, right? They hate blacks or they hate whites or they hate Asians or Hispanics, you name it, whatever. But most people don't care enough to go broke, right? They don't want to impoverish themselves for the sake of some emotion. And what is Walter Williams talking about? Well, in the South, in the time of slavery, there was a phenomenon called self-hire. I tried to find where I mentioned it before, but I had talked about self-hire or quasi-free Negroes in another episode, but I can't. It wasn't in the title, so I can't figure out when and which episode it was. But what is self-hire or the quasi-free Negro? Well, it basically was an acknowledgement of a reality, right? So you may recall that a lot of laws in the South uh, said that your spread, your plantation size was determined by how many slaves you had, right? And so the more slaves you had, the bigger your spread, the more acreage, right? The more land that you were going to get. And so a lot of people just, you know, had a lot of slaves, not because they could work well, because, but instead, but they wanted more slaves to have more land. Well, if you're not going to farm it all, if you're not going to work all of that land and your slaves largely are there because you wanted a bigger plantation, well, they're not working all the time, but you paid for them Now you have to house them, you have to clothe them, you have to feed them, right? And that's expensive. And they're not doing any work for you. So, you're losing a lot of money. To avoid and cut those losses and maybe even make some more money, you allow the slaves to get a job, right? And so basically, someone else would come up to the slave owner and they would say, "Hey, I need laborers for this job." And so the slave owner will say, "Well, how much are you going to pay me for the use of my slaves?" Right? And so the person would hire all of these slaves because they would be cheaper than other workers, white workers that they would have to hire. And plus, the white workers weren't all that great anyway. So you had better workers. Now, why would slaves be better workers? Because they get paid too, right? And so they get to make money on the side. Hey, we're a slave, we're stuck here, but what? I get to make money? All right, I'll do that. And so you can imagine how these slaves, given the opportunity to work and make money, even though it is very, very low wages, but it's better than nothing. And so they worked really hard so that they would continue to get hired, right? Because there was an incentive there. Not all slave owners did this, of course. And so their slaves had to sneak out, right? If they were near a port or near a city, then they could sneak out, work all night, then come back to the plantation during the daytime. Okay, and so, but a lot of slave owners, they hired out their slaves. It was beneficial for the slave owner because their losses weren't as high. Slaves enjoyed it because they were able to get paid, and some of them were able to buy their own freedom. And their employers certainly liked it because they got skilled labor at rock bottom prices. It worked for everybody. Okay. Frederick Douglass, who I've talked about on this channel, was a slave and he got a job working on a ship and he bought his own freedom, right? It took a while, but he was able to do it. So now you have all of these people working as slaves. And now you can't, and some people, especially if they were working with the permission of their so-called master, well, they're working during the daytime. And so you're going to see a lot of other people, whites even, who sees all of these working blacks. And some of these whites are not as well off as these black slaves. In other words, they don't have as much money. People don't understand, but there are a lot of poor whites in the South, right? And so, but they can't get a job because um, all the slaves took the jobs, right? It's the same problem as when you have a prison population, like what was that movie, Shawshank Redemption, right? And so, if you saw it, if you haven't seen it, you got to go see it. But the prison warden said, "Oh, we're going to make use of the inmates. They're going to work, right?" But what they can do is they can underbid all the contracts. They have near limitless labor, right? And they get to charge below market price. And so everyone else can't get a job. Well, that's similar to the slave situation, right? Because all these slaves are working, whites can't get jobs. And so now you have a lot of angry people. And so you see the rise of Jim Crow laws, right? Because they were getting resentful. Um, yeah. So even the first Richard Allen, who started the first black denomination, the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal AME, right, church in 1794, and they bought church property to build their church in 1805. Right, who'd have thunk it? Right, it's the heart of Philadelphia, and it's still there. Right, so extra legal measures and legislation are only this is Walter Williams. Extra legal measures and legislation are only necessary when those prohibited behaviors are being carried out in a relatively free society. Why would laws and extra legal measures be necessary to restrict whites from hiring blacks or blacks from selling to whites or whites serving blacks in restaurants if whites did not want to make these transactions in the first place? In other words, regulations and legislation are only passed because people are already doing those things. And so all over society, whites are serving blacks, right? And some people are upset by this. They're like, this is not right, right? Because they are the racists. Like if I'm in a restaurant and I refuse to serve black people, well, then all the blacks and a lot of their friends are going to my competitor's restaurant. So unless I change my beliefs towards blacks, I'm going to go out of business. But instead of changing, what I do is I go to the mayor's office and I say, you got to write a law. No one's allowed to serve colored people, right? So that's what happens, right? So these laws are passed because people are doing the very things that it's trying to prohibit. All right. So legislation and regulations function to protect discriminatory behavior, right? Legalized racism. So legislation thus removes the cost of discrimination and forces everyone to pay the same. Look, why would you shop at a store? Because the prices are good. And so now you're going to say, well, I'm going to shop over here because the prices are lower. I'm going to hire these workers because they work for less. But once you pass laws like minimum wage or standardized pricing, then what happens is there's no difference. Whether I go here or there, it doesn't make a difference. And so people will generally gravitate to some businesses over others. And it turns out that fewer people then will, cater to colored people. So the big picture here is that this is probably why the South was economically behind. They were poorer than the North, okay, because they had all this arbitrary legislation in the South, which disallowed good discrimination for people to seek out the best prices and the best quality, because that price of discrimination was erased by legislation, then it didn't really matter. And so no one was looking for better, higher quality because it all costs the same. Um, so people get away with the legalization of discrimination or the legalization of racism because they use a different word. They're not going to say, we are legalizing racism. No, they don't do that. As I just said, they're going to introduce licensing, right? That way, everyone is properly equipped and trained for this occupation they're about to take. But obviously, it has nothing, the licensing process has very little to do with training or equipping. Even the driver's license exam, right? You have to practice and get training yourself, and you just show up to take the test, right? And by passing the test, apparently you are ready to drive. And given the driving experience on American roads these days, clearly there's something wrong with the licensing process. Am I right? So during slavery, people would outlaw self-hire because of racism? No, 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 because they might be dealing in stolen goods, right? And this is how they do it, right? So you're not being a racist, you're trying to cut down on the trafficking of stolen goods, right? You see, this is how they do it, right? But of course, it's impossible to sustain. And the presence of so many illegal migrant workers, right? People who are working on the farms. And I've told you before, my trouble getting a landscaper to return my call, this is, shows you that, you cannot criminalize lower wages. You can't do that. People just work under the table. They work, black market, whatever, but you cannot make it so that no one ever does it any longer. Um, in the North, where there wasn't slavery, there was more freedom. And so it was the freedom not to be lazy, but the freedom to work harder, right? And so in the North, you see that a lot of the business people, service-oriented businesses and craftsmen like furniture making, all of this, they were controlled by African Americans. They dominated by African Americans, including catering as well, right? And so you didn't go to a white business for these things. You went to the black business because they were always the best. Now, I paint this picture, but obviously it's not all gravy. It's not all good feels, because some people really did hate what was going on, and they went after, slaves, self-hire slaves with extreme prejudice, right? And it ruined it for everybody. But keep in mind that in the North, in spite of the fact that blacks could work harder and were able to become extremely wealthy in some cases, it, you know, there was eventually there was more the rise of competition from poor white immigrants, right? And so you had waves of immigrants coming into the United States. They worked for even less than the black workers. And so that was the threat, you see. Asians did the same thing, right? If no one liked you because of your slanty eyes or whatever, then what you did was you just charged less. And so then you made sure the quality of your work was just as good as everybody else, or you do something different, like do their laundry and have restaurants. Okay. And so you become creative that way as well. So in conclusion, arbitrary racism fails because it ignores the individual, not just the individual of the targeted race, but in the race who patronize their businesses, right? So not all blacks are the same, but not all whites are the same either, right? So not all whites had a problem with blacks. Not all whites had a problem with going to black businesses or serving black customers, right? And in fact, some people fell in love with each other. Come on, right? So arbitrary racism does not take any of those things into account. And to go further, skill is not attached to skin color, right? It's an easy example. Not all blacks play basketball and not all whites cannot jump, right? And so skill is not necessarily attached exclusively to one or another skin color. It's not like all Asians are good at math or all Asians eat rice. That was going to be my title of the episode, right? Like my kids, uh, a couple of my kids are allergic to rice, allergic to soy, tofu is soy, right? Soy sauce. They're allergic, so it's almost like they're disgraceful Asians, right? People talk about watermelon and fried chicken. And whenever people start saying, "Oh, you like watermelon and fried chicken," I'm thinking, "What? Are we talking about Koreans? Because Koreans love watermelon and fried chicken. You go to Korea, man, every corner they're selling watermelon and fried chicken." So arbitrary racism or discrimination is extremely costly, really expensive. And but if you want to keep making those choices, it's totally up to you. It's a free country. Walter Williams said that he wanted to marry a black woman. Well, that's his choice, but it's more expensive. Like if he could say, "I'll marry anyone, the first person through my door," right? Well, that's really cheap. But if he says, "I'm going to be picky," oh, now the cost of getting finding someone increases, right? So arbitrary, and when I say arbitrary, you might say, well, what makes this person unattractive to you that you're not going to marry them? Well, they got big toes, or they make weird noises when they eat, that's arbitrary, right? So, oh, that's a deal breaker. Can't marry a person because of that, right? Arbitrary discrimination is costly because it reduces your choices, but it's up to the individual, right? The problem only arises when you legislate your discrimination as being the discrimination for everyone. Everyone has to discriminate the way I want them to. That's when it becomes a problem. And so freedom to live and make the choices that you want, that's always the solution. Mind your own business. Find what makes you happy and then live in peace. That's what it's all about. And that brings a conclusion to this slightly longer than normal episode. And I hope you have a great weekend. I'll talk to you next time.